Good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Woodley. I'm the president of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or CJPME, and I will be your host for tonight's event entitled BDS and the Labor Movement. In CJPME, we have the tradition of recognizing the Indigenous peoples whose unceded land we live on as a gesture of recognition and reconciliation. So in that spirit, based in Montreal, I live on the unceded territory of the Kenyan Kahaka Nation. It's important to note that this area where I live has been a meeting place for First Nations for millennia in this region. So this is the third webinar in the series 6 that we're doing on BDS. The first session was delivered in March and provided an overview of the BDS movement, how to get involved. That was called BDS 101, how to join the movement. The second session was at the end of April entitled, Is BDS Illegal or Anti-Semitic? Breaking down common myths, where we address some of the common attacks and criticisms of the BDS movement. And both these previous webinars are available on CJPME's YouTube channel, so I invite you to check them out if you haven't been able to attend. We do have another 2 or 3 webinars planned for this BDS series in the months ahead, so do stay tuned. But for tonight, we're going to explore how the labor movement in Canada has fought for Palestinian rights. We'll cover some of the successes and challenges in getting labor unions on board with BDS, and hopefully provide practical advice for moving forward. So like our previous webinars on BDS, we'll have 2 segments of our evening here together. The first part of the webinar will feature Michael Boycott, who I'll introduce in a moment, and who'll present some basics on the state of the BDS movement within labor. And then he's going to invite Professor Katherine Nastovski, PhD, who's an academic at York University, to provide some context for this discussion. And as well, he will also a little bit later introduce and bring Hasan Husseini into the discussion. Hasan is a longtime labor and solidarity activist and a key organizer with Labor for Palestine. So the presentation and conversation between Michael and Katherine and Hasan will take about 40 minutes. Of course, the second section of the evening will be dedicated to Q&A, so Q&A from our audience here. So at any time during the webinar, even during the first part, you can submit questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen in the control panel. Just type your question in the Q&A and all the panelists will see it. And we'll try to address as many of these questions as possible as during the Q&A session. And so we do thank you in advance for submitting your questions. We will officially wrap up our evening together after an hour. But if there are some questions that we still haven't addressed, our panelists have agreed to stay a little bit later if need be, but I'll jump in at 9 o'clock and let people go at 9 if they want to. And if we still have some questions, we'll continue a little bit longer if need be. So just a word about CJPME before I invite Michael to begin. Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East is an organization whose mission is to empower Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East and here at home in Canada. We do a whole variety of things: advocacy campaigns, policy analysis, speaking tours, training, lobbying to politicians, and many other things. We have about 150,000 adherents in Canada, with local volunteers who help us in virtually all of Canada's major cities when we do events there. CJPME, for its part, formally announced its endorsement of BDS in 2008. And since that time, has sought creative ways to support this Palestinian-led movement ever since. So we believe that BDS is a concrete way for Canadians to direct their anger and frustration, and we want to do everything we can to encourage and empower the movement in Canada. So we are pleased and proud to host this webinar series on BDS. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first presenter and my colleague tonight, Dr. Michael Boycott. Michael is a VP, Vice President of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. He joined the team in June of 2020. Since joining the team, Michael has had a dramatic impact, of course, in expanding the scope and the rigor of our work. Prior to joining CJPME, Michael earned his PhD in sociology with a specialization in political economy from Carleton University in Ottawa. His dissertation compared opposition to the BDS movement targeting Israel to the opposition in the 1970s and 80s to the boycott of apartheid South Africa. Michael has published in a number of different journals and media outlets in recent years, and his research has been cited by the Washington Post, CBC Ottawa, BuzzFeed News, and the South African Broadcast Corporation, the Electronic Intifada, and many others. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Boycott.
Thank you, Tom. Really great to be able to have this conversation tonight about BDS and the labor movement. It's definitely a very timely conversation. We wanted to have this in part because it's 15 years after one of the most significant BDS votes in Canada, which is CUPE Ontario's vote in 2006. And there was also a recent not successful vote at CUPE National just a few days ago, and a lot of other votes in between that we'll be talking about. So, but there's a real legacy here and a real history that I want to get into. Maybe I'll start off by just saying a few words about BDS. As Tom mentioned, this is part of a series on BDS, which is the international movement urging the use of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel in order to put pressure on Israel to stop violating international law and to respect human rights. So BDS is a movement that was launched in 2005. At the time, it was endorsed by 170 Palestinian civil society organizations. And it is an invitation from Palestinians to the international community directed to all of us, asking us to join them in their struggle for justice. So for an in-depth introduction into sort of the origins and thinking around BDS, I encourage you to check out our webinar from earlier this year, BDS 101, How to Join the Movement, which is on YouTube. This evening, though, we do want to discuss more specifically BDS and the labor movement. In part because the labor unions have really been at the forefront of the movement for BDS in Canada. This might be considered surprising as the issue of Israel and Palestine are not necessarily considered labor issues per se. However, the Palestinian labor movement itself has been a strong supporter of BDS for many years and has promoted these tactics as a tool for international solidarity. So I wanted to put up this slide to give you a sense of how significant Palestinian support for BDS is among labor unions. All of the major Palestinian trade unions supported the initial BDS call in 2005, and they're all members of the BDS National Committee, which represents Palestinian civil society and gives direction to the movement. So some of these organizations include the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions, the General Union of Palestinian Teachers, the General Union of Palestinian Women, and many more. So this commitment to BDS started in 2005, but was formalized and reaffirmed in 2011 when unions came together to form the Palestinian Trade Union Coalition for BDS. So they put out this statement of principles that's really important, proclaiming that BDS is the most effective form of solidarity with the Palestinian people. The coalition called on trade unions around the world to do the following: to actively show solidarity with the Palestinian people by implementing creative and context-sensitive BDS campaigns, for port workers around the world to boycott loading or offloading Israeli ships, which is similar to steps taken during the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa, and for trade unions around the world to review and sever all ties with the Histadrut, which is the Israeli Labor Federation, which in practice supports Israel's occupation and is an opponent of BDS. So just to give you a sense of how big this labor coalition is, here's a list of its members, and I'm not going to go through them all, but they do include the General Union of Palestinian Workers, the Federation of Independent Trade Unions, the Union of Palestinian Professional Associations, unions representing women, teachers, co-ops, peasants, writers, public employees, and more. So this represents virtually the entire labor movement in Palestine. And it is noteworthy that all of these statements from South Africa, from Palestinian civil society groups, they always point to the reference of the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa. And that's important because it serves as an example of when the labor movement around the world took a principled stand against apartheid and adopted these same tactics of BDS, in that case against South Africa. And I do want to pause on that because Canada's unions at the time actually had provided significant support for BDS campaigns against South Africa, including significant material financial support to South Africa's liberation movements like the African National Congress, as well as labor groups like the South African Congress of Trade Unions or other groups that were doing labor mobilizing on the ground. So some of those groups were actually banned organizations or were even considered by the government of South Africa to be terrorist groups. But it wasn't just financial support that Canada's labor unions were giving. As part of their true commitment to the struggle, Canada's unions responded to demands from those organizations who were calling on the international community to adopt these tactics of boycotts, divestment, and to convince the government of Canada to impose sanctions on South Africa. At times, this labor solidarity took very creative forms. In 1986, a number of major unions held a week of action against South Africa. This included the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and the Communications Workers Union and some others. And it was a week of action to promote sanctions against South Africa. And so this was a week, but during one of those days for 24 hours, there was a work stoppage that was very interesting, where workers performed these creative workplace-based actions. Postal workers, for example, refused to service mail that was coming in from South Africa. Airline reservation agents refused to book flights to South Africa. Communications workers refused to place telephone calls to South Africa. So if someone wanted to call someone in South Africa, the communications agent would refuse to place that call. Dock workers would refuse to board ships to South Africa. So this was a very dramatic display of solidarity, but it was very similar to the type of action that unions were carrying out across the country throughout the 1980s, and not just in Canada. And this, I think this is a legacy to be really proud of, and it's the same historical legacy of solidarity that the Palestinian BDS movement is hoping to replicate and build upon, and apply the same tactics and principles to support their own struggle for freedom. Now, one common objection to BDS that you might hear and which is relevant to this discussion in particular, is the suggestion that BDS is somehow against the interest of workers. So you might hear the question, if we boycott Israel, won't that hurt Palestinian workers the most? We don't have to get too much into that, because on the face of it, the answer to this type of question is quite obvious. It is, after all, the Palestinian labor movement, which represents the interests of Palestinian workers, and they are the ones who are behind this push for BDS and who are urging us to adopt it. So for them, the struggle against apartheid and occupation in Palestine is more important than continued business and jobs on the ground, if those are connected to ongoing oppression. So it's important that we take the lead, obviously, from Palestinian workers themselves. But neither is this argument a particular a unique or new one. In fact, the exact same arguments were made during the apartheid South Africa, during the anti-apartheid movement. This was actually a very common line of attack against those who wanted to boycott South Africa. And I've put on screen a number of clippings of different types of propaganda from the 1980s, which all provide different versions of the same typical argument that boycotts and divestment were that they would somehow disproportionately hurt Black workers the most. So we have an image of a magazine article with a headline, "Consequences of Sanctions on Disinvestment," and an image of a famine in Africa. We have a clipping of an op-ed exploring how actually, they say, Black opinion in South Africa is opposed to boycotts and sanctions. And we also have an image of part of a pro-apartheid comic from the mid-1980s. We have an image there of a woman who's supposedly a Black African trade unionist saying, if Americans withdraw, it will lower the general standard of living and Africans will be the first to suffer. So once again, these arguments fell short at the time, just as they do today, precisely because it was the South African labor movement, including the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which were on the forefront of the movement calling for boycotts in the first place. And these same South African labor organizations today, like COSATU, are actually major supporters of the BDS movement in support of Palestinian rights, because they see the struggles as being as linked and in common. And I just wanted to show this as well. This is a clipping of a I guess this is an order form for union t-shirts for a campaign. Labor says sanctions now, and they've put in, they're making fun of this argument with an image of Brian Mulroney, who was the prime minister at the time, the speech bubble saying, talking to Ronald Reagan, won't this shirt hurt Black workers most? And Ronald Reagan saying, I'll check with Maggie, referring to Margaret Thatcher. So again, this was such a common line of attack. It really was the most common form of argument in defense of South Africa that the labor unions had a little bit of fun with it. Now, I wanted to bring us back to today because the contemporary BDS movement, like in the past, has had some huge successes when it comes to bringing Canadian unions on board against apartheid. To give you a little bit of a sense of that history, I wanted to briefly review some of the major unions to endorse BDS since the movement was founded in 2015. So in 2006, most significantly was the Ontario branch of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, or CUPE Ontario, which held the first landmark vote to support the BDS movement. This was only 1 year after the movement was founded. With this resolution, CUPE Ontario pledged to pursue BDS until Israel complies with international law, and also pledged to create educational resources around Israeli apartheid. And in a few minutes, actually, I'll be talking to one of our guests about that vote, how it happened, and what it meant. Over the next few years, BDS would be adopted also by the Quebec Teachers Union, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and Quebec's House of Labor. It's also been adopted by the Public Service Alliance of Canada, Quebec's Confederation of National Trade Unions, Unifor, which is Canada's largest private sector union, as well as very recently by CISO, which is a coalition of more than 60 Quebec trade unions and civil society organizations. So this is a very broad sweep of major unions in Canada have already endorsed BDS, which is really great. And I should probably note too that there are other labor-related groups that have also endorsed some kind of sanctions on Israel, if not full support for the BDS movement per se. Just earlier this year, we saw the Canadian Labour Congress and the NDP, the New Democratic Party, which is affiliated with unions. They both adopted member-supported motions in support of an arms embargo on Israel, as well as a ban on settlement goods and other measures. So that is also definitely in keeping with what Palestinian trade unions and civil society are calling for. Finally, I just wanted to say just a few words about how BDS can be put into action by labor organizations. It's not just about getting the resolution itself, but you can actually implement it. BDS tactics can be pursued in very different ways, and the BDS movement does urge us to think about it creatively and be attentive to our individual context. But I'll provide a couple of examples of what unions can do. When it comes to boycotts, unions can refuse to source goods and services from Israeli companies or from companies that might be complicit in the oppression of Palestinians. In some cases, unions might be able to engage in workplace actions, for example, by refusing to load or handle goods from Israel or from Israeli settlements, as in the examples from the South African anti-apartheid movement. In terms of divestment, unions can seek to divest their pension funds from companies, either maybe they're invested in the settlements or maybe they're just invested in military weapons in general that might be being used by the Israeli military to oppress Palestinians. In terms of sanctions, unions can take a principled political stance and join the broader labor movement in calling for sanctions, including an arms embargo. So for those interested in pursuing these strategies, whether you're a worker in your workplace, you want to get your union on board, there's different resources you can turn to, including Labor for Palestine, who I'll be speaking to later, as well. The BDS movement itself on its website, it has some resources around specifically around trade union solidarity, and they can also get you in touch with organizers. And so we'll provide some links after this to some of those resources. Okay, so now I've spent some time looking at the overall context I'd like to now move into a couple of interviews with individuals who have had significant experience in labor organizing around BDS, going back to when the movement first started again in 2006. So I'd like to invite Katherine Nastovski on to join me, please. Katherine, I think Tom already said a couple of words about Katherine, but she's an assistant professor in the Work and Labor Studies program in the Department of Social Science at York University. And she's the former chair of CUPE Ontario's International Committee, which was a key organizer behind the landmark vote to adopt BDS in 2006. Thanks for joining us, Katherine.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for inviting me.
So maybe if you could just start by telling us how you got involved in BDS in the first place, and how did this vote at CUPE Ontario happen?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, we didn't expect to be debating BDS at that convention. At the time, I was on the International Solidarity Committee, and we put in several resolutions, and we did this, for the purposes of education. Members will read the resolutions, and then we have education forums, etc. And so we put in probably 8 or 9 resolutions on a whole range of issues, and so we just happened to have some support within the resolutions committee to actually bring it forward, and so on the day of, I guess, or maybe the day before the vote, we found out that it was probably going to come to the floor. So we organized at that time. Hassan, who will speak later, was also there. We decided who's going to get on the mics. And so it was quite last minute. We organized people together, and after one person spoke, a member from CUPE 79, municipal local, they called the question, and it passed almost unanimously. So,
wow. Do you remember where that push for BDS came from? Because it was only a year after the initial call in Palestine. I'm not sure that many people would have been familiar with it already. Can you tell us where did that come from? Who sort of brought it forward?
Sure. Yeah. So, well, I was at the time, I was in CUPE Local 3903 at York, and there were 2 activists at the time who founded the coalition against Israeli apartheid, both of whom are Palestinian, and they brought this forward to the committee. And so, we were always looking to put in resolutions and take direction from movements on the ground, and for our resolutions to reflect those demands and do education. So there are always, that's how we that was our approach to designing resolutions. Is to follow those directions, to have some action component for members to take on, and also for there to be education as well.
Right. And were you, I guess, surprised that the BDS vote passed? What do you make of that?
Well, we honestly didn't even think it would make it to the floor. So just in light of, what Hassan will be speaking to later in terms of the recent CUPE vote, just a few years before, there was a vote on a resolution at CUPE National that was defeated. And it was a very simple kind of, liberal, very tame end the occupation resolution, and it was defeated quite handily from what I heard. I wasn't at that convention, and so we were told also, because of backlash to a resolution at CUPE Ontario, another end the occupation resolution in 2002, because of the backlash, that we were told, or that's how I understood, that no leader was going to allow it to come to the floor, right? So we assumed it was going to be blocked by the leadership, but we were lucky in that Sid Ryan agreed that if this is what was going to be debated, he was not going to stop it from coming to the floor, and And so we were, lucky to have that debate, and we, scrambled to organize our speakers, and we were lucky to have it go through.
And Sid was the head of CUPE Ontario.
That's right, the president of CUPE Ontario at the time.
Right,
Yeah.
and he has been, at least since then, a pretty vocal Palestine supporter. Was that always the case? Was that the case at the time, or was it sort of a surprise that he let it go?
Well, I mean, I think he had some experience from the resolution in 2002 at CUPE Ontario, so he had some knowledge, but I think he had to learn quite a bit more on the fly, to defend kind of a, trial by fire. He really, luckily, his assistant had been to Palestine, his EA, and really had a lot, did an amazing job at, quickly getting him up to speed on things. And he was there, very visible and vocal, taking media calls, and right from the get-go. And that was, because we knew the backlash was coming. And so immediately after the resolution, he agreed, let's meet it head on. And we put out a press release being very clear in what happened, and it began. So, yeah.
Yeah, can you tell us about what some of the reaction was from his critics? Today, we know that BDS the opponents are very vocal. Was that the case at the time?
Yes, definitely. So I mean, there was what you would expect in terms of people, Zionist backlash specifically, in terms of emails and threatening phone calls and those kinds of things. But I think there was also critics within the union. There were, a lot of local leaders who were not necessarily opposed to, BDS, didn't really know anything about it, or didn't really know anything about Palestine, but were really upset that the committee hadn't really prepared them for what was going to happen. That, if we were going to put something forward, that there should have been a lot more education. And there had been some education within CUPE, not around BDS specifically, but there were, the books, The Wall Must Fall, that were produced by CUPE BC, and then CUPE National also produced a version after our resolution that included some discussion of BDS as well. So there had been some, but it wasn't, I think a lot of locals felt unprepared for the kind of backlash they faced from within their unions. And so that was definitely, I definitely think that still has an impact even today. And Hassan can speak to that in terms of where people are at within the national, because I think that was definitely, that is one of the legacies of that, the fact that it was such a surprise motion. There definitely, it did create some hesitancy amongst some elements in the leadership.
So because the backlash was so fierce, and because it came from, they weren't expecting to have a debate on that issue, they saw the experience around the backlash with the 2006 vote, and so you think that might be behind some of the sort of the reason why maybe some union leadership might not want to have that vote at the national level.
Yeah, it's part of it. And that's why we thought it was not going to come, to the floor at all, because, for the most part, they want, a lot of union leaders want to avoid having to deal with, that backlash. And, and it was quite extensive, where, there were staff that were being, intimidated, like, admin staff at the CUPE Ontario office, etc. So, there was a lot to manage at that time. And I'm sure other locals had that too, so.
Right. You mentioned some of the education work that happened before. One or two of, I guess, of the parts of the resolution was about doing more education work within the union. Can you tell us about some of that? What came out of this? What were the consequences of this?
Sure, great. Thanks, Michael. So, basically, that is what we ended up, our committee ended up spending the majority of our time on quickly after the backlash. And the backlash did subside after, there were, new bombings of Gaza quickly a couple months after the resolution, and that quieted quite a bit. So we quickly started developing education materials, drawing on, we had a lot of support from, Palestinian activists and also Palestinian solidarity activists, student solidarity activists who were involved in the coalition against Israeli apartheid, bringing all that material together and developing a clear labor angle, making it accessible. And so we developed those materials, and then and there's some folks who are here on the webinar who were involved in the education work. We had about 30 activists. We did train the trainers, and people went around to locals, to conventions, to sectoral meetings, all sorts of things, wherever we could go, even small local meetings with an executive of 20 people. So there were people went in pairs, and we had a PowerPoint developed by CUPE Ontario education staff, education and communication staff, and with the committee. And and so we probably sent out education materials. Well, that went throughout the whole membership, but we did educationals probably, I don't know, with, it went over, we did it for over a year, going to locals and so forth. So if you include convention forums, etc., definitely in the thousands of members. So they were very interesting in terms of responses from members. And I think, this, what we learned, one of the things we learned in the education work is, that while the backlash, the criticisms, we have from outside in terms of Zionism, one of the most difficult things internally in terms of education, aside from, say, this kind of ideological opposition, is really where members don't understand why we would be spending any time talking about Palestine or anything besides this current round of bargaining or what have you, right? So it is really, at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest challenges we have with Palestine solidarity and solidarity in general, is this kind of business union framework and an idea about what a union is and should do. And so I think that's a huge challenge for us.
Right. And that would I'm sure that affects a lot of different attempts to get the union to get on board with lots of issues beyond Palestine, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Just my last question for this period before we move on. Just generally, do you have any thoughts on the significance of that vote for, I guess, the BDS movement in Canada in general?
Well, it definitely gave us a lot of energy. It was pretty shocking. It really spurred a lot. Also, things quickly, because of the backlash, there was, quickly connections made with a lot of South African trade unionists who then, got things rolling in terms of like getting things done within the South African trade union movement as well. And so there was all these pieces coming in order to support us. So the backlash had that other piece of connecting folks, connecting us to other groups that were acting, and also really bringing forward the BDS call for people who didn't know about it. I think it really brought it to the forefront and really made it a center point in terms of, well, this is actually what is being called for by Palestinian trade unions. So this has to be this has to be what we're fighting for. And so that definitely changed things. I also think the apartheid analysis was was huge. This was a huge shift because of the BDS call from Palestine and the way that it was framed. It really shifted the discussion, shifted how Palestine was discussed, from just, a few years before in terms of the kind of end the occupation language, really shifted. And it allowed also connections. And I see Ken Lookhart is here today on the panel, is one of the key organizers from the SACTU Solidarity Committee in the 1980s on the labor front. We were able to make those kinds of connections. And so things developed really quickly, a lot of connections and solidarities. We learned a lot. And there was a lot of activity for several years around this, really building a whole community and connections, and out of which Labor for Palestine developed as a when we transitioned from the CUPE committee being the center of the work to Labor for Palestine, drawing in folks from who are interested in doing this work from other unions as well. So
great, thanks so much. So hopefully you'll stick around for the Q&A a little bit later, so we'll come back. But I think now we'll move on for Hassan Husseini, if you'd like to join. And as we switch over, it's great that you mentioned Ken Lookhart is on the call. His work with the SACTU Solidarity Committee is what a lot of my examples are really based on, including the work of action in 1986. It wasn't just unions. The SACTU Solidarity Committee was really active in agitating locals across the country to get involved, to donate to these trade unions in Southern Africa, organizing to get the lists of what's coming in on South African ships so that they could go and organize in different union locals. So yeah, I definitely wanted to give a shout out to the SSC because that was a very significant factor in the 1980s. So great that Ken can join us as well. And Hassan, let's move on. So Hasan Husseini is a longtime labor and international solidarity activist and an organizer with Labor for Palestine. He's a national negotiator at Public Service Alliance of Canada and a member of Unifor Local 2025. So thanks, Hasan. How did you get involved with Labor for Palestine? Can you tell us a little bit about what the organization is and what you do?
Thank you, Michael and Tom and CJPME, of course, for organizing this very important and timely discussion. I've been involved in the international solidarity movement and labor movement for a long time now, and so involvement, of course, with Labor for Palestine dates back essentially to the time it was founded. And many on the call would know that Labor for Palestine originally started in Toronto as a labor caucus of the coalition against Israeli apartheid in Toronto, following the call that Katherine spoke about of the 170 plus union and civil society organizations in Palestine for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. So at that time, I'm in Ottawa, of course. At that time, we established a group in Ottawa called Trade Unionists for Justice in the Middle East. So we did similar work to Labor for Palestine, but we were not directly connected with the Labor for Palestine group. The organization, of course, in Toronto went through, up and down in terms of the level of activism and engagement, following its golden time, if you will, after the passing of Resolution 50. And it stopped being active for a number of years in the interim. A group of activists of us attended an international, I think it was an international labor meeting in Hamilton in the fall of 2017. That was organized by, amongst other folks, Katherine and Thomas Colomba, who's, I believe, on this call as well. In any case, a number of activists came together at that time and said, look, we need to regroup and reestablish Labor for Palestine. And now we have it as a network of activists in solidarity with Palestinian workers and people who are fighting for the liberation. It is a network right across the country. We have a coordinating committee that coordinates the work, that has representation from unions, sectoral, and right across the country, regionally speaking. Our activities and our engagement has been increasing since 2017, and the latest being the support we provided to members of CUPE when they put in that motion resolution at the convention last week at the CUPE National Convention in Vancouver. Of course, it was virtual, but it was supposed to be in Vancouver.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about this most recent CUPE vote? What happened? What was going on there?
So that was a full BDS resolution that was put forward. For those who would like to read it and haven't had a chance to look at it, they can visit the Labor for Palestine website and take a look at some of the resources we have there, including the text of the resolution itself. I think that there are a number of factors that led to the defeat of the resolution. First of all, I'd like to say that the numbers, for those who again didn't follow that discussion, the numbers were 38% voted in favor and 62% opposed. Unfortunately, because of the virtual nature of this convention, we lacked the face-to-face engagement with members. I think that didn't play favorably for us. On the day of the vote itself, a lot of members were not present to vote, and we have reason to believe that a lot of people who maybe became complacent because the resolution had the support of many across the country in various locals and bodies within CUPE, including many in the leadership, that they didn't think it would fail. And although we tried to certainly get people there, so that there were a lot of people who were not there for the vote. I believe also, these are, by the way, my estimations. We haven't done a debrief fully, but these are my own opinions as to what happened. I also believe that leaders, and as I said, there's a significant change. In the 2006, we had Sid and a couple of others who were supportive but still timid, perhaps in some respects, whereas at this convention, we had the support of CUPE leaders from across the country who are leaders of their own divisions, whether it would be Manitoba or the East Coast or BC or what have you. So we did have that support, but I think we didn't see them take that lead on the floor of the convention in support of the resolution. I think that may also have played a role. I think we didn't prepare for it in advance as much as we should have, in the sense that we didn't bring activists together weeks and even months before to start planning. So maybe that also played a role. And I think also, finally, in my own estimation, there was a fear factor that Zionists on the floor of the convention played into. This resolution is, supporting terrorism and anti-Semitism and so on. So people some people, I would say, perhaps bought into that kind of fear mongering. And on our part, we should have talked more about the goals of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, as opposed to just say support BDS. Okay, BDS in and of itself, there is a goal behind it, and there are three main goals for it. And I don't think we elaborated and we educated enough the membership on these goals behind the BDS to be able to win the day. Once again, I want to say this is not the debrief or the opinion of the Labor for Palestine or the CUPE caucus of Labor for Palestine. This is my own personal viewpoint of what may have gone wrong this time around. It's still significant, though, that 38% voted for it, and we have a network of activists now across the country from CUPE who are ready to take this into the next stage, including at the local and regional and provincial levels.
Thanks. Despite the fact that this latest resolution didn't pass, there have been many successful BDS votes in the labor movement over the years. What do you make of the state of the labor union support for BDS today? Do you feel optimistic? What do you think?
Indeed, yes, I am actually optimistic because I've been around the labor movement in various capacities right now for 25 years. And I can tell you that there's a significant change in where the labor movement was and where it is now in relation to support for Palestinian workers and Palestinian people's struggle for liberation. Historically, you need to understand that the Canadian labor movement, including and particularly the Canadian Labor Congress, had very close, very intimate relationship with the Histadrut, the Israeli Labor Central. And Histadrut delegates attended many conventions of the Canadian Labor Congress and vice versa. That is not currently the case. While the CLC has not severed the relationship with the Histadrut, which we hope they would, but they don't have that relationship anymore. And we haven't seen a delegate of the Histadrut attend any convention of the Canadian Labor Congress in decades. That is just a symbol of where we were and where we're heading. But I can tell you that, as I said, with respect to the number of activists, the level of analysis that we are seeing coming out from various unions right across the country, the support that we are receiving for various campaigns we are engaging in as Labor for Palestine and others, our allies, including CJPME and Independent Jewish Voices and others. We certainly note a significant change in the position of the Canadian labor movement in relation to the Palestine solidarity from those days to where we are at now. But we still have a challenge. And the challenge is to materialize, to transform formal support in the form of resolutions into concrete actions on the ground in relation to boycotting the Histadrut, for instance, and severing relationship with them, engaging in direct boycotts of companies that deal with the Israeli apartheid system and the settler colonial state, as well as direct divestment. As an example, look at the pension plans that we all have as union members of various unions, and target campaigns to divest from Israel and any companies that work and support the settler colonial state of Israel. And this is where now I think the next stage that we need to move into, now that many, and you reviewed them at the beginning of this webinar, the many unions that have formal positions in support of BDS. This is our next stage and our next challenge.
Right. Just before we maybe move into a broader Q&A, do you have any advice for union members who may be interested in getting involved in BDS activity in their own workplace?
Well, first of all, I would say check us out, get in touch with us. We have resources. We're developing more resources to be able to support those activists, to have a discussion internally and to push forward for clear positions in support of the Palestinian people and Palestine solidarity generally. So get in touch with us. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, on Instagram, as well as on our website. And I want to say that one of the things that we learned from, and I think you alluded to it, you spoke about it, that the labor movement during the 70s and 80s in particular in support of the campaign against the South African apartheid was pushed from below. And so we need those activists right now to keep the pressure on the leadership to take those good positions and to not only speak truth to power in relation to supporting the Palestinian struggle, but also to begin to take concrete actions to put pressure on Israel and its supporters in Canada to abide by international law and to push towards the liberation of the Palestinian people, or to support the liberation struggle, shall I say.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Why don't we get everyone back on, Katherine and Tom, for a broader, further discussion of this. Tom, were there any questions coming in that we should talk about?
Well, we do have a number. You guys did mention that we have Ken Lockhart on the call with us. He's made 2 comments. Maybe some of our labor friends, Hassan or Katherine, would you like to comment any more on Ken's comments here, or give him thanks for his legacy, perhaps, or obviously impressive stuff?
Yeah, I'll just say I learned a lot from Ken. Ken has always been huge support, and we went out to, where did we go, Ken? London Labor Council. We went to several labor councils, talking about the connections and the apartheid analysis, and it was wonderful. And I do think it was huge. We, when we were starting Labor for Palestine and moving from the committee, we really did try in very consciously to, organize, use some of their strategy, some of the strategies from the SAC2 Solidarity Committee. Absolutely. Yeah. So.
Well, I see we also have some comments from Marian Polak, who I guess was also has been very active for many years in CUPW. Hassan, Katherine, I guess she's acknowledging here. She says that the CUPE vote actually influenced CUPW, I guess, as well.
Indeed, yes, good to see that Marian has joined us. Absolutely, as Katherine spoke about earlier, the CUPE Ontario vote had a great deal of influence over what other unions did afterwards. They charted the road. They opened the door to a lot of other unions to take full BDS positions, including CUPW, true, yeah. And Unifor and PSCC and others, I would say.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, in terms of what Marian was saying, Marian was involved also in Labor for Palestine. And, we really did at that, try to, forge inter-union connections around this work, share in terms of education resources, try to develop delegations and campaigns. And I think that was really important as we, try to think about how we could broaden out from CUPE, because it was very focused initially, and CUPW was definitely the strongest, had the strongest group of members who wanted to take a leading role. And as Hassan was saying, the conference we had in 2017, again, now CUPW was really taking a leading role there, with their activists making up the majority of the room to reestablish the work. So
yeah, maybe if I can pick up something from Marian's point, as well as something that Katherine, a point you made near the end of your intervention earlier, helping union members to think beyond the current bargaining agreement. I mean, what are there things that either people within the labor movement can do to sort of broaden that perspective, or are there things that activists that aren't in the labor movement could do, or groups like CJPME or Independent Jewish Voices Canada could do to help sort of any advice either for labor movement members or people outside the labor movement in terms of helping labor to sort of see that broader role for itself?
That's such a big question. I mean, it's such a I think I think the work that Labor for Palestine is doing is important. I think doing the education and trying to make those connections, which we really tried to do in the education work, compare the work, like comparing BDS to a picket line, trying to make sense, trying to make this make sense of why anti-colonialism is a workers' issue, why why you can't change conditions for workers in Palestine without challenging Israeli apartheid, how integral that is. And so, but in terms of the those kind of deeper issues. It is a question too of capacity, and I think those are issues that unions are struggling with more generally. There's only in most unions, there's only a small group of people who actually see the union as more than or even know what their union is. I always find with my first year students in labor studies, students who are in unions don't know what union they're in even. So it's really, those are deeper issues that we need to think about. How do you, that's work that the unions need to do, union activists need to do to bring folks in. So yeah, there's a lot to do.
Yeah. I was actually listening to a podcast a few days ago, and they were talking about how instrumental, and I forget which union it was, but there was a union that approved or pushed for maternity leave in Canada, and they won maternity leave, and that ultimately led to Canada adopting a policy on maternity leave. See, yeah, postal workers. Okay, that's what it was. Right. And for me, it's like that was eye-opening in terms. Yeah, the labor movement is this sort of the tip of the spear in some respects. Yeah.
On that earlier point that you made as well, Tom, I think it's it's an ideological position that we saw a sample of it come at the CUPE National Convention just recently, this past week, where a constitutional amendment was brought by one of the components of CUPE to only focus and use members' dues for essentially bread and butter issues, and that is just collective bargaining, and not do any international work or not spend any money outside. And that is we have to contend with that point of view within the labor movement, and we need to work with organizations such as CJPME and IGB and others on Palestine, but generally speaking, on the need and the importance of international society. We live in a capitalist world, and the oppression of one people in one place is very intimately connected to the oppression of people in another place, particularly when many of our multinational corporations and our own governments are implicit and complicit and directly involved in the oppression of people outside, all over the world. And so without international solidarity, we would be missing a big piece of who we are as labor activists and as unions in this country.
Thank you, Hassan. Yeah, excellent points. I guess a few of the early questions from Malcolm about ways to potentially influence the Ontario NDP convention coming up in February. Don't know if you can see his questions there. He's sort of looking for advice. Any advice you might give to Malcolm ahead of that? He's saying at the last Ontario NDP convention, a BDS motion was defeated. And he says actually a number of the people that opposed the motion were actually union members.
Correct, yes. I think that we're seeing also a change in the NDP, perhaps not as fast as we would like, but also at the national NDP convention, the first motion that was brought forward 2 or 3 years ago, I can't remember exactly when, failed. But this past spring, there was a convention, I believe in March or April, I can't remember exactly when, or maybe February, that passed. Hopefully that will have a positive effect on the CUPE Ontario NDP convention, and ultimately it's going to be the NDP activists themselves who need to carry that forward and run with this campaign. I can tell you also that there is an intimate relationship between the NDP and the labor movement, of course, and we are seeing both of them are changing. Sometimes some unions and the NDP, some of them are a little slower than others, but it is changing. Ultimately, there has to be push from activists themselves, and with also the most recent position taken at the last Canadian Labour Congress convention in June, maybe that will help some of those timid NDP Ontario labor activists to no longer oppose this drive towards taking a principled position on the question of Palestine.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if Malcolm is more than welcome to talk to us and reach out, and we can strategize together on how we can help with the upcoming NDP Ontario convention.
Yeah, thank you, Hassan. And I would echo that. Malcolm, if you'd like to reach out directly to CJPME, obviously Labor for Palestine, start with them. But I think CJPME will want to do what we can to support Labor for Palestine and anything you might want to do, Malcolm, as well. So we're both here to support the type of thing you want to happen, Malcolm. Thank you. I see a question here from Terry from BC. Hassan, he wanted to follow up on a point of yours about moving from motions to concrete BDS actions. I think this ties into some of Katherine's points about the education. Are there things that Canadian unions are doing in regards to boycotts and divestments?
Unfortunately, at this point, no. And that's what we need to change. And as I said, that we need to transform those formal resolutions into concrete actions. I believe that there may be a campaign specifically that may be coming up in relation to Canada Post. As many of you know, that Canada Post does not recognize Palestine. So if you want to send a parcel to Palestine, you have to put Israel because Palestine is not recognized by Canada Post. So that is very concrete campaign that we can engage in. But I dare say that I haven't seen any union yet that has adopted a BDS position, translate that into a concrete campaign for divestment or boycott or calling on the government beyond the formal letters to actually put pressure on them to impose sanctions.
Yeah. There's a related question here that is directed more to Katherine from Neil. Katherine, he's asking, he liked your comment about how the framing, shifting the framing from occupation to apartheid was something that helped people sort of understand what was going on and helped amplify sort of the message of BDS or the need for BDS. Do you want to comment a little bit more about that?
Sure, I'll give one example. The person we were working with, the staff at CUPE Ontario, helping with education, she had a close friend who was a Zionist and had been to Israel several times. And she went through the material and thought about the apartheid analysis, and it just was like, that was it. That was our first experience before we even got everything. And she was so hardcore that, before we, they were going to have maybe a staff strike, she made sure we got our material so we could get out there and start doing education. So I do think it really does shift the debate. And I think somebody else had a comment there in terms of Indigenous struggles. And I think that's also, it is key in terms of thinking about it within the lens of colonization. I think really does help think about it in a very different way and get people out of thinking of it as, this, whatever, two-side religious struggle or something that is like incomprehensible and too complicated to even touch, right? And that is an issue for many members. They're just really, and we found that in the education work, that once we did the analysis, people were like, okay, so what? And it was so early that we didn't really know what to boycott. They wanted to know, and we were like, okay, HP, or we were thinking, we were just at the beginning there. But yeah, it really did help the apartheid analysis and the maps in particular, that visual, in terms of settlements and all of that. Was huge.
Yeah. I've often pointed out that, part of the challenge on this issue is not so much to win the debate, but to have the debate, have the discussion. And the other side wants to make it appear very complicated and very controversial. And so just sort of having just a calm, reasoned debate or calm, reasoned discussion on this is so important. So yeah, that's a fantastic way to think of it and present it. Michael and all Hassan and Katherine, I don't want to sort of be the one driving necessarily the questions here. If anyone else would like to, if there's a particular point in the Q&A there that you'd like to pull out, please feel free to do so.
I did notice that
go ahead.
one of the comments from Larry mentioning the vote by the CAUT Council last Friday rejecting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. I guess it is a labor success story. This was, I guess, to go back a little bit. So the day after the disappointing result at CUPE, there was a very successful and fantastic outcome at the Council for the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which represents 70,000 faculty and academic staff unions. Well, that many members. I'm not sure how many exactly how many unions are affiliated, but they voted unanimously on this position to oppose the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which CJPME and many others have warned conflates anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. It's definitely relevant in this context because one of the things that IRA people try to apply IRA to, for example, are BDS campaigns on campus. So part of the strategy is saying BDS campaigns violate this definition of anti-Semitism in this sort of this very broad way that they interpret it. Therefore, universities should intervene to withhold student fees if they support BDS, or to basically ban or disallow that activity from happening on campus. So this is certainly a huge step towards sort of defending academic freedom and protest like BDS on university campuses. I think it was a unanimous vote in favor of protecting the right to participate in BDS on campus. Essentially, in practice, that's what this means, which I think is really great. And so that's definitely a success story that has not gotten nearly enough attention. So I think there are some positive things happening, and it's possible that one of the reasons that succeeded was because people could see that it related very directly to their own workplace rights. It was very much directly connected to their own academic freedom workplace issues, which may helped in sort of convincing people that this is not something, we're not going out on a limb here. This is about defending, the things the principles and rights that we stand for. So yeah, I think it is good to mention some of those as well.
I should say, well, I guess I was enjoying the discussion so much, I didn't realize 9 o'clock had come and gone. So as I promised at the beginning, we have gone beyond the hour, and certainly if people feel they need to go, this is your I'm giving you the freedom to go. We probably will stay on just a few more minutes. There just are a few more questions. We've gone through most of it, but please don't feel like you have to stay on, but we will maybe do a few more points here before we wrap up. So thanks so far for everyone joining us. Sorry, Michael, so you had jumped in about the CAUT vote on IRA. Hassan and Katherine, is there anything you guys wanted to comment on that you're seeing in the Q section, the question section there? Some of the questions relate to actions taken that could be taken by unions or should be considered by unions. And I guess Hassan, to some degree, addressed that a little bit earlier, saying that one of the weaknesses so far is getting sort of to the point of sort of concrete actions, concrete campaigns to follow through on the BDS votes. But if any, yeah.
I think some activists as well, some of the comments, particularly Ronnie, who is a CUPE activist, pointing out that at the convention, there was linking the struggle of the Palestinian people with the struggle of the indigenous people here on Tether Island in Canada. And I think that is very important. And we're seeing those linkages being made more and more. And I think we need to pay more attention to that. I think it's a principled position. B, I think the commonalities of the struggle of the indigenous people, both here and in Palestine, is a point that we need to make and link concretely with indigenous activists in Canada through this mutual solidarity. And I think it was effectively made by some indigenous CUPE activists on the floor of the convention. That was very good. So that's a good point raised by Ronnie, absolutely, that I wanted to comment on.
And I guess she makes this other point that you were sort of linking to earlier, or maybe it was Catherine. She's saying Bill 32 in Alberta aims to keep union from addressing social issues, which is a very scary sort of development, isn't it? Either you guys want to comment on that? Do you see the other bills like that, or is that just characteristic of a conservative provincial government?
You go ahead, Hassan.
Well, I mean, it's coming in different ways and forms, right? I think we saw with the Ford government what the attack they did against the students with respect to their work and the funding that they get. Yeah, so this is not unique to Alberta, and I think we're going to see it more and more. And I think it's important to recognize that they are fearful of the fact that the BDS movement and support for the Palestinian struggle for liberation is going mainstream. And so they're really, and in particular when it comes to the labor movement, and so, and the student movement and so on. So one way for them to do it is to try to curb that, to stop that, to halt that, through some legislative means, through regulations that will prevent us from being able to use either members' money to support international solidarity struggles and students' money and their dues to go to campaigns on campuses to support raising awareness with other people around the world. So we're seeing it, and that's part of the struggle that we need to continue to engage in. And the IRA definition is part and parcel of that overall struggle as well. It's not separated from it. Hence, the vote at CAUT is critical in terms of opposing those draconian anti-democratic measures that weaponize such definitions as it relates to the question of anti-Semitism, and it dilutes the real fight against anti-Semitism.
Yeah. And quite often these things, you know, you don't want to assume too much, but so often you have these sort of movements that sort of these sort of bills or these sort of legislative initiatives, and they're sort of couched in very general language, but then quite often it's tied back to someone who doesn't want BDS to happen or doesn't want Israeli apartheid week to happen or things like that. And you know, it's just very often ties back to those things when you dig into it, doesn't it? Yeah, good points. Catherine, anything in the Q&A that you'd like to address? Really great comments from our audience here. Really, I think you've brought in the discussion very appropriately and brought in some good points. So thanks. And see a number of people have been commenting here that are involved in their own way, in their own context. And it's great to see that. See, of course, Greg, who was involved in the CAUT votes. So great to see that. Should we wrap up, guys? Anything else anyone would like to comment on or make a point on?
I'll just say that it's great seeing how much you know, in the comments, how much people are interested in moving things forward. I see the energy there, and there was a lot of folks on the call, and you know, really want to go into those concrete actions, and I think that's great. You know, as we move forward, thinking about concrete actions that we can take and coordinate around, and I think we're in a different moment right now, and I'm hopeful like Hassan about this. I think there's lots to do, but I think there's good energy and people are stepping up, so it's great.
Yeah, you know, I was Hassan, your comment about you know, being optimistic about the future sort of caught my imagination as well, and maybe this is a turning point. Maybe there are a lot of people sort of connecting through this webinar, and maybe this is a way to sort of let's join forces, and each person sort of each group or each you know, each body that's sort of working on this maximize their strength and support, bolster one another's efforts and so on. But I think we've got some good momentum, and I think let's hope some things, some exciting things happen in 2022, starting with the Ontario NDP convention. So Malcolm, but yeah, please, folks, let's continue the discussion. Michael, any comments from you before we wrap up here?
No, that's great. But thanks again to our guests for joining us today and for everyone who joined us for this discussion. I think it's been really constructive and energizing, and hope to continue these webinars, future looking at other areas of struggle for BDS in different, not just unions, but other groups in society, and how we can find new avenues to support Palestinian rights.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that came out of the CJPME AGM last week was someone had suggested that we do roundtable events in the coming months. And everyone sort of felt that was a great idea, Michael and myself included. Of course, Zoom enables that. Everyone's now able to do Zoom. So maybe we can think about doing some roundtables around labor and supporting labor activists and so on. So maybe something to think about in the months ahead. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us. It's really been a pleasure hosting this event. Thanks, of course, to our panelists foremost, Katherine and Hasan and Michael. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to participate in this event and taking the time to prepare it. Thanks especially to Michael for all the hard work you put in to organize this and to facilitate the event, and for preparing the introductory slides. Thanks again to our audience members for joining us. We had really some excellent questions and feedback and input. So thanks to all of you who submitted questions and participated. Our apologies to anyone who submitted a question that we weren't able to get to. So wishing everyone a good rest of your evening. Take care, and we'll hope to see you again at our next webinar. Good night.